weapon. I've held an AR-15 in my hand. I wish I had it. It is as heavy as 10 boxes that you might be moving. And the bullet that is utilized, a 50 caliber, these kinds of bullets, need to be licensed and do not need to be on the street.
So limit possession of guns, meaning just certain guns.
What type of guns?
For starters, the AK-15.
Are you for gun control?
Yeah.
Who should control the guns?
Who should control the guns? Probably the government.
Do you trust the government?
No.
Hey guys, this is Dylan from American Concealment Solutions. We're a holster company, but we're going to be talking about something a little bit more serious in this video, and that's going to be gun violence in America and the statistics to go with them. Gun deaths, everything about it. We're going to break it down. This is going to be a fully comprehensive video. You've heard time and time again from politicians and celebrities and people alike, whether you're, at work, out in public, whatever, that have a certain belief that guns should be, registered or limited or controlled or outright banned. And a lot of times they'll offer some kind of statistic or some kind of fact that they believe to be true that may not actually be true. And so that's what this video is going to be for. It's going to be an educational video talking about all of those kind of statistics. We're going to break them down and we're going to see what the actual truth is. So before we get into it, a quick disclaimer. We are not statisticians or anything of that nature. We pulled all of these stats from bipartisan sources. We even pulled statistics from left-leaning sources and right-leaning sources, and we're going to use all of those. So we kept very bipartisan when it comes to the numbers. That's what's important about this video, is to actually obtain the truth and not some kind of clouded judgment call. So when it comes to the sources, we're going to try to cite them as much as possible, and as we speak about them, I'm going to try to give you a lot of the statistics that we're going to go over are going to have, I'm going to mention where they're from or who did the study, but not all of them, because this video would be like 5 times longer than it is right now. So if you do see a statistic that you'd like to see a little bit more of, you can, search it yourself, or you can mention it down in the comments on where we found that, and we'll try to get back to you as quickly as we possibly can. But all of the sources are either from federal institutions like the FBI, the ATF, stuff like that. You're going to see a bunch of that. National organizations, third-party organizations that are typically conducted by people in colleges or some kind of university. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the statistics, but they're all going to be organizations of some sort or governmental agencies. So we'll go ahead and start the breakdown of, before we get into the actual statistics, let's talk the overall numbers of gun deaths in the United States. I'm going to be peeking down just every once in a while if you see me on the camera, just looking at my cheat sheet of all the numbers, because we have hundreds of statistics and numbers, and I'm not going to be able to remember all of them and look you in the eye every time I talk about a statistic. The overall gun deaths in the United States as of 2021, which is the latest year that had the most comprehensive data ran for the national scope of gun deaths, was 48,830 gun deaths overall. Now, to break that down a little bit further from the 48,830, 54% of that number was suicides. And that is 26,328 people. 43% of that number was murders, or 20,958. 549 of those instances were accidental in the total overall gun deaths. Law enforcement accrued 537 of those overall gun deaths, and undetermined was the last 458 gun deaths. That is the overall breakdown of the gun deaths of 2021. So let's talk about the more the largest portion of that overall gun deaths, and we might be censoring some words throughout this video to make sure that this video stays up on things like YouTube and stuff. And we'll talk about suicide. Now 55%, 54 to 55, it depends on the statistic you're going by, but 55% of suicides involved firearms. So a little over half of all suicides in the United States involved a gun, and they also make up the vast majority of overall gun deaths. Now, something to think about when it comes to people that are in the mental state of being willing to self-harm themselves, offing themselves. Does taking away the right to own a firearm, or just taking away that firearm from that person that is not mentally well, does that make them less suicidal? Obviously not. So it does not make them, it does not help the overall cause of why they feel that way. So, mental health is obviously something that is a crisis across the world, and that I think both sides of the political spectrum can agree on that, mental health is a problem. Loneliness, there's a bunch of stuff. The pressures of modern day living and stuff definitely get to people. PTSD, stress, trauma from childhood, stuff like that. So taking away a firearm from someone does not make them any more better off mentally. So that's not the solution to the problem. Addressing the mental health is. And then you also have to take into consideration that places with very stringent gun control, or even outright bans, but places like with very stringent and very limited gun ownership, like Japan and South Korea, for instance, they are suicide capitals of the world. They have more instances of suicide than the vast majority of the world, and they don't have as much access to firearms as, especially the United States, but a lot. They're in the upper echelon of gun control. So that is it's a small example of how though they don't correlate. Now, moving on from suicides, which can be definitely a touchy subject, is the next largest portion of gun deaths in America, and that is murders. Now, we have a little bit more statistics in regards to murders than suicides. Now, talking about murders by guns, 8 in 10 murders involved a firearm. So, from a standpoint of what is most effective, that is most likely why a firearm is used in those murders. Now, if you're talking about from 2019 to 2021, 23% increase in gun deaths. That's overall when it comes to the actual, not just murders, but overall gun deaths. Now, 2019 to 2021, at the same study, gun murders increased during COVID 45%, and 10% of suicides was increased as well. So not only in murders, but also suicides, there was an increase during the pandemic era. And we can, kind of draw a little bit of conclusions to that. Mental health obviously wasn't at an all-time high during those times of shutdowns and the lockdowns and all that kind of stuff that was happening during the pandemic. That wasn't good for mental health, and then also it wasn't good for crime either, because there was a lot of problems with that. Now, in 2021, talking about the study from 2021 again, gun deaths per capita in 2021 were 14.6 per 100,000. It's the highest rate since the early 1990s. When you talk per capita, which is very important in these statistics, this was below the per capita rate from a study done in 1974. Now, in 2021, it was 14.6% per 100,000. In 1974, it was 16.3 per 100,000. So when you're talking about the 70s to a couple years ago, the per capita rate of murder, gun deaths per capita, went down. So the whole argument that gun deaths are going up with the rampant purchasing of firearms and everything is not true, because the per capita, which is, per 100,000 according to these statistics, it's saying that it's going down, and we're hitting a pretty all-time low for the recent generations that have happened. Since 1903, which is the earliest year that this kind of data is available, the per capita rate of gun accident deaths has decreased 95%, from 3.1 to 0.14 deaths per 100,000 in the US population. That's another thing that's extremely important to understand, is that, of course, that's gun accidents. So that's, the improper use of a firearm. That's a bunch of different scenarios. But saying that, all these people are ill-informed of handling a firearm, or they don't know what they're doing, or that's not true. We're using firearms more safely and owning firearms in a more safe manner than we ever have since 1903. So the trend is very staggering, that the more we go on as a society, the safer we get. The more education there is available, the more tools there are available to properly utilize a firearm and own a firearm in a safe manner. Now, going back, talking about accidents again, there were 458 fatal firearms related accidents in 2018, the lowest since at least 1903. So that just kind of talks about the actual numbers there, in terms of outside of per capita. Now, moving on from murders, let's talk about murders per state, because I think by state, that kind of shines a little bit of light on where the totality of gun deaths are, and what can be done to mitigate those. And it just kind of debunks a little bit of myths of, gun deaths in this area are much higher, or gun deaths in this area are much lower. The top 3 states with the highest gun deaths per capita in the U.S. are Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Mexico. Mississippi having 33.9 per 100,000, Louisiana having 29.1 per 100,000, and New Mexico at 27.8 per 100,000. A really weird and very consistent correlation that we see, especially within the top 8 of the worst performing, highest gun deaths per capita states, is that, for instance, all 3 of those states that I just mentioned are at the bottom 5 of economies in the country. There is a staggering correlation, especially within the top 8 gun deaths in per capita states. There's a big correlation with gun deaths and how low their education is. So the higher the gun deaths, the lower the education level. And that's a pretty staggering correlation that we see for the most part in the 50 states. On the other side, Massachusetts, the lowest ranking ranks in the top percent economically, and top 3 in education. And in other states with a low overall gun death, they're in a lower percentile in either education or economy. So places like Massachusetts, who are flagship leaders in education, also have lower gun crime, gun deaths in particular. Now, without taking into consideration suicides in with the overall gun deaths, Washington, D.C. is the highest for pure murder rates, and states like New Jersey and New York are no longer in the lowest numbers when you only count murders. If you look at overall gun deaths, including suicides, New York and New Jersey are on that list. But when you take it off, they become a lot higher on that list in terms of murders. So again, we talked about suicide and how it doesn't really change the fact that they're still suicidal when they don't have access to a gun. There's still a problem there. There's still a problem to themselves, a problem to society. It's just not a good thing to have. So the fact that they're masking that number with the totality of suicides is a little disingenuous. And talking about states and not trying to get right and left versus each other kind of thing, but the vast majority, vast majority of the most dangerous cities in the United States have been run by Democrats for multiple years. The vast majority of the murder capitals of the United States are, one, currently run by Democrats, two, have Democrats that ran before them for multiple terms. Very few of them have Republicans in the offices. And if they are, they're like sprinkled in. It'll be like a Democrat's running it now, the previous one was Republican, and then the previous three before that Republican were also Democrats. So that's something to consider. Now, before we move on to a couple other more hot topics like mass shootings and stuff like that, let's talk about the actual breakdown of what firearms were used. Most importantly, let's talk about the scary hot topic of rifles. We see that time and time again when some kind of instance happens, rifles are the first ones to be attacked or put in the spotlight, sometimes when they're not even involved in the situation that just happened. And most importantly, we're talking about the assault rifles like AR-15s, AK-47s, and the related family of rifles like that. Now, kind of like a quick breakdown of overall gun deaths and the weapons used before we really break into rifles. The most recent year for which the FBI has published data, which is 2020, it says that handguns were involved in 59% of the U.S. gun murders and non-negligent manslaughters for which data was available. Rifles, the category that includes assault weapons and hunting rifles, accounted for 3%, or 408 deaths total of firearm murders, and shotguns were involved in 1%. The remainder of gun homicides and non-negligent manslaughter, which 36%, involved other kinds of firearms or those classified as type not stated. So with the available data that we see, handguns contribute to significantly more of the overall gun deaths in the United States. Rifles, these big, scary, 30-round killing machines, make up 408. Now, talking a little bit more about rifles, putting it into kind of perspective of that 408 number of the overall deaths in 2020 using rifles, and that's ARs, hunting rifles, anything that's classified as a rifle. In that same time frame, 1,400 stabbing deaths were accounted for. So almost 4 times as many people were stabbed to death in the United States than were killed with rifles. And also, when you also think blunt objects and literally just hands and feet also attribute to significantly more deaths per year than rifles do, by a staggering margin. And you can't really legislate hands and feet. So that's another thing. And another kind of silly one to kind of really put it into perspective is according to a 2019 article by Michael R. Conover. Hopefully I pronounced that right. He's from Utah State University. It says that over 700 people are killed annually in the United States by wildlife. Now, that is just to kind of put it into perspective that you're more likely to be, killed by a deer or a pack of coyotes than you are to be killed by a rifle. and then you kind of think of the likeliness of you actually getting into a situation to where you would be killed by a pack of coyotes, and you're like, well, that really wouldn't really happen, you know? So that's something that kind of paints a picture. So the AR-15 is most certainly, you know, chalked up to be some kind of big boogeyman when it's really not. And anyone who wants to ban assault weapons or whatever jargon they want to say, if they're not really talking much about handguns as well in that situation, that's kind of flawed logic, because a death is a death, and, you know, limiting the amount of death is important. So if 59% of deaths are committed by a certain tool, you would think you would add that into your jargon, but they don't. Moving on from rifles and moving on from the actual firearms used, let's talk about mass shootings. And this is a pretty sensitive topic, but it's definitely one that needs to be talked about, because people on like the left, for instance, that want to ban AR-15s like we just talked about, they use mass shootings as the ammunition to, no gun pun intended, as a means to try to limit gun rights and the actual guns used. So definitionally, there are certain organizations that do a bunch of statistics that classify mass shootings in different ways, definitionally. So the FBI definition of an active shooter incident is one or more individuals actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. Now, there's one other organization that we pulled information from other than the FBI, and that is the Gun Violence Archive. It's an online database of gun violence incidents in the United States. It defines a mass shooting as an incident in which 4 or more people are shot, even if no one was killed, again excluding the shooters. Using this definition, 706 people died in these incidents in 2021. Going back up to the FBI, it says that in 2021, 103 people died in an active shooter incident, not including the shooter. So when you have the FBI, they're saying 103 people in 2021 died. If you take the statistics from the Gun Violence Archive, by their definition, 706 people died. So take that for what you will. Those are the definitions. So that's the information, and those are both decently, you know, esteemed sources to get your information from. Now, going to the FBI found an increase in active shooter incidences between 2000 and 2021. There were 3 such incidences in 2000, but by 2021, that figure had increased to 61. Over 80% of mass shooters at K through 12 schools stole guns from family members, according to research funded by the National Institute of Justice. That's a program of the United States Justice Department that examined mass shooters that took place from 1966 to 2019. The figure comes from a study by gun rights advocacy group, the Crime Prevention Research Center, The group in a 2018 report asserted that 94% of mass public shootings since 1950 happened in gun-free zones. That is a number that has some gravitas to it. So we see that backing up slightly, obviously from 2000 to 2021, the overall mass shooting incidences have increased. Going to the statistic that 80% of mass shooters from K through 12 schools stole guns from family members to commit the shooting, and that's from 1966 to 2019. So that's a pretty big span of time. A felony was committed before a mass shooting happened. So there was already a law preventing that person from legally obtaining that firearm. Now, of course, if you do own a firearm, it is your job to keep that firearm safe and out of the hands of people who have no business owning it. And that's inarguable. That's an obvious thing that you should do as a responsible gun owner. So keep that in mind. But at the same time, how many more laws out of the hundreds, if not thousands of laws that we have weighing down on us every single day in terms of firearm control and all that kind of stuff, how many more laws do there need to be to where these kind of instances no longer happen? Because banning guns won't happen. We have, 500 million guns in this country and counting every day. We have a complete black market, illegal ring of arms dealers that would only give the opportunity for criminals to have firearms instead of the law-abiding citizens that would just turn in their firearms, for instance. So that's not really a good argument for the gun control activists. And last but not least, talking about that last statistic that I said earlier, is that the 2018 report asserted that 94% of mass public shootings happened in gun-free zones since 1950. Why? Let's empathize a little bit. Why would the shooter target gun-free zones in these situations to where a public mass shooting takes place? It's because that they don't want to die. They don't want to get shot back. They don't want to have rounds returned at them because they're cowards and this and that. And you can insult them all ways that you can, and rightfully so, because they're scumbags. But it still doesn't change the fact that they're targeting certain areas because they are fish and barrels. They're easy targets. And this is an argument that you can't really refute. In a more recent shooting, the shooter initially wanted to go to a school to shoot it up, but they figured out that there was a armed resource officer there. And because of that being a significant deterrent, they changed their target to a unarmed school and committed horrible crimes. And they had to wait until police officers arrived to take care of that business. And so that's happened time and time again to where mass shootings happen in places to where legal law-abiding citizens are unable to legally have a firearm on that premises. And if they do, they run the risk of catching a felony, and that's not cool. So we'll go ahead and move from mass shootings. But keep in mind that if someone does kind of say, like AR-15s are the problem, they're not. The problem is that there's someone in this world that thinks that committing a mass shooting is appropriate or something that should be done, which kind of goes back to mental health, that goes back to societal decay that's been happening, that goes back to psychotropic drugs, which that's a whole different conversation. A lot of stuff there. So we've been talking a lot about negative stuff. Let's talk about the pros of gun ownership, some of the more important things of owning a gun, some of the benefits of owning a gun. So first, let's talk about a statistic that's been relatively suppressed over the last few years. A while back, this was a statistic that went around, 5-6 years ago, and upon trying to find it again, it's found to be pretty buried even on the internet. And I kind of uncovered why. And so Gary Kleck, he's a professor emeritus of the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Florida. He published a study citing that between 60,000 and 2.5 million defensive gun uses happen every year in the United States. The CDC's report, based on Kleck's findings, stated another body of research estimated annual gun use for self-defense to be much higher, up to 2.5 million instances, suggesting that self-defense can be an important crime deterrent. So it goes on to say that some studies on the association between self-defensive gun use and injury or loss to the victim have found less loss and injury where the firearm is used. In conclusion, the study used by the CDC seemed to have indicated that firearms are more likely to save a life during a self-defense incident than to be used to take one in a violent crime. That statistic is very heavy. So if you're talking about, 48,000 overall gun deaths, if you take it just to murders, it's half that. It's a little bit more than half that. So like 20,000 murders in the entire country, compared to 60,000 to 2.5 million uses of preventing a violent crime from happening using a firearm. So, in conclusion, the study used by the CDC seemed to have indicated that it does help. And, that right there, these statistics have been, used by many in many legislative debates, often deterring many of the strict measures many gun control politicians have attempted to pass. And I remember them using that very often in debates, and that could just because it's such a strong statistic. It's very powerful. But recently, finding it in the last few years has been very tricky. And that's because it mysteriously got removed from the CDC's website. And, it kind of makes you think, like, is it no longer true? Has that been debunked? Has that been proven to be flawed in any kind of way? And the answer is no. Emails obtained by the Reload present a clear picture of gun control activists lobbying the CDC for the removal of that report. Initial introductions to top officials at the CDC on behest of the activists were orchestrated by the White House and the Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, in a completely different set of emails. In one email, one of the activists, Mark Bryant, wrote that 2.5 million number needs to be killed, buried, dug up, killed again, and buried again. And that Kleck's estimate, the person who initially did the study, has been damaging to the political prospects of passing new gun restrictions and should be eliminated from the CDC's website. Now, the CDC initially resisted the removal of the study, but after a meeting in September of 2021, decided to go forward with the requests. Beth Reimels, Associate Director for Policy, Partnerships, and Strategic Communication of the CDC's Division of Violence Prevention, wrote, "We will also make some edits to the content we discussed that I think will address the concerns you and other partners have raised." Never having been consulted on the removal of the statistics, Kleck stated that the CDC is just aligning itself with the gun control advocacy group. It's just saying we are their tool and we will do their bidding. And that's not what the government agency should do. And I personally agree. So very nefariously it got removed in the early 2020s, 2021. And for reasons that have nothing to do with debunking the myth or, finding new data or updating it into a more whatever kind of light. So that statistic is still held up very well, and it was supported by the CDC until gun lobbyists paid them off, essentially. Kind of going back on to what Kleck says, he says that more guns in the streets equals more crime, but in fact, concealed carry permit holders are, well, this actually isn't Kleck, I'm sorry about that. A statistic that we are kind of going on about talking in regards to the pros of firearms, the whole argument that more guns on the streets equals more crime is not true. And obviously, gun ownership is at an all-time high, and, gun crime is, doing what it's doing. We've already kind of talked about that. So in reality, in terms of concealed carry permit holders and concealed carriers as a whole, even people that are, constitutional carry and stuff like that, people who do conceal carry, they are much less likely to commit crimes than average people or even police officers. So concealed carriers commit less crimes than people who uphold the law, police officers. And that's a pretty significant statistic. And we'll kind of get a little bit of a ratio here just to kind of show like the big disparity between these people. According to data compiled by the Crime Prevention Research Center, concealed handgun permit holders are extremely law-abiding. In Florida and Texas, permit holders are convicted of firearms-related violations at 1/12 of the rate at which police officers are convicted. Now, people are saying, yeah, like, it's going to be the wild, wild west, and, concealed carry people, like, I don't trust them out and about and all that kind of stuff. And, it scares me to death that someone could be walking by me while concealing a firearm. They are 1/12 of, they are 1/12 the fraction of how many crimes police officers commit. It's insane. That kind of statistic is so strong. So the whole idea, and then also at the same time, concealed carry civilians in defensive firearm uses are significantly more accurate with their gunfire as well, if they do have to deploy their firearm, than police officers are. They get hits on target a lot more accurately, and they use a lot less rounds than police officers as well. These statistics, they're better shots, they're more efficient shots, and they're significantly safer than people even that are trained to do it for a living than as police officers are. So the whole idea that someone carrying a gun is inherently dangerous, or they're more dangerous than any other kind of person, is just completely false. Now, another big argument is, what about the United Kingdom or Canada or Australia or this or that, or what any other kind of country, and they compare that to the United States. Well, let's talk about it a little bit, and let's kind of go through a little bit of numbers in regards to that might shine a little bit of light on those statistics. So guns that are illegal in countries like Cambodia and Somalia, they have extremely high crime rates, even though they have very, very stringent gun laws that prevent people from just going and buying a gun like we can in the United States. But also at the same time, that's not really a correlation, because again, we've already talked about, like Japan and South Korea and stuff like that. They also have really stringent gun laws, but they have really low crime rates. So that kind of disproves that just because gun ownership is restricted, therefore crime is restricted. That's not the case. There's, plenty of places in Africa and South America and, even Asia, like Western Asia, and, places in Europe that are heavily restricted on gun ownership, but you don't want to go there. There's a lot of problems there. Kind of going into the UK, after the United Kingdom banned handguns in January 1997, its homicide rate rose by 50% over the following 8 years. The rate returned to earlier levels only after a 14% of increase in the number of police that they have on hand. That right there shows that just because handguns got abolished there, which is the largest factor of overall gun deaths, right? It took an increase of police to even get it to be better. It got a lot worse over the last 8 years, 50%. Now, when you talk about Britain, 59% of the burglaries in Britain, which has tough gun control laws, of course, are hot burglaries, which are burglaries committed while the home is occupied by the owner and renter. By contrast, the U.S., with more lenient gun control laws, has a hot burglary rate of only 13%. So significantly less burglaries are committed with people inside the homes and people with firearms as well. So that's a lot of kind of statistics in regards to that. And also you see the same kind of trends in Australia. After the 1994 ban, I'm pretty sure, and they destroyed all their rifles and destroyed all their handguns, we saw a rise in overall crime and violence. The gun deaths that occurred prior to the ban of firearms in Australia was replaced with blunt objects, knives, and all these other kind of other means of hurting someone. So we don't see that. Now, let's go ahead and get boiled down even more in terms of the United States gun deaths, because that's really what's important here. And it's the real problem with it's the real cause of the deaths that we see, and that's criminals. 71% of gunshot victims had previous arrest records. That's insane. 64% had been convicted of a crime previously to that instance. Victims had an average of 11 prior arrests. So recidivism is most certainly intact in the United States. Not. 63% of victims had criminal histories, and 73% of that group knew their assailants. Twice as often as victims without criminal histories, by the way. 74% of homicides during the commission of a felony involve guns. So while a felony is being committed, 74% of homicides occur. That's interesting. Only 25% of victims and 13% of perps did not show any evidence of engaging in criminal/deviant lifestyles, i.e. prior arrests, gang membership, drug dealing, prior to the homicide. So that's saying that criminals are committing these homicides at a substantially higher rate than, your normal civilian, most certainly law-abiding civilians. Recidivism is exceptionally high among criminals with previous gun-related charges, 70% higher than for non-gun first offenders. So the chances of someone acting again on feloniously is much higher with people who involve firearms in their crimes on the first time around. In total, about 10 to 11% of crime guns come from retail sources. So the whole fallacy of, these people are legally buying firearms and then they're going to commit crimes, it's completely false. This is according to an ATF study quite a while ago, about 20 years ago. The ATF said that 10 to 11% of gun crimes come from retail sources where background checks are conducted. About 2.3% of guns used in violent crime come from retail sources. Only 7.3% of traced guns were recovered from the individual who first bought the gun. So this fallacy that people are these law-abiding citizens that are going to gun stores and buying guns and all that kind of stuff, the chances of them going and committing a crime with that gun are so monumentally low. 60% of convicted felons admitted that they avoided committing crimes when they knew the victim was armed. 40% of convicted felons admitted that they avoided committing crimes when they thought the victim might be armed. So that goes to show, at the same time, back to the mass shooting incident, why do people target gun-free zones? Because they're not armed. And so a lot of these people, they just want to commit a crime. They don't want to die. They don't want to get in a shootout. So that's a huge deterrent. That's a really big correlation in this whole video, is that when there's law-abiding citizens owning firearms and carrying firearms and having firearms at the ready, that is a huge deterrent for nefarious things to happen. Now, 90% of all violent crimes in the United States do not involve firearms of any type. That's something as well. And that kind of shows that it's not really the guns that's making all of this kind of criminal activity happening. 2/3 of the people who die each year from gunfire are criminals being shot by other criminals. That's a pretty strong statistic as well. 92% of gang murders are committed with guns. Gangs are responsible for between 48 and 90% of all violent crimes. So while organizations are lobbying to restrict you, a law-abiding citizen, from owning a firearm or being able to carry a firearm or any of that kind of stuff, there's no, war on gangs. There's no, lobbying for any kind of serious mental health solutions in the United States. Yet they're trying to make it to where you can't buy your Glock 19 without waiting 58 days and all this arbitrary stuff that has proven not to work ever. Speaking about waiting times, the time to wait kind of thing, a lot of some states to where there's a cool down period to where when you buy a firearm you have to wait 3 days or 7 days, or it depends on what state you're talking about. Some states don't do that. A lot of states don't do that, but there are laws to where there needs to be a waiting period. This statistic kind of debunks that. The time to crime of a firearm is about 11 years. So meaning the time the firearm is purchased brand new to where that same firearm is actually used in a crime is at roughly 11 years, making it very rare that a newly purchased firearm is used in a crime. So waiting periods don't work. At the end of the day, the numbers matter, and time again, regardless of what source you're getting your statistics from, a law-abiding citizen responsibly owning and using a firearm is always a net benefit in society. In the United States, a law-abiding citizen owning a firearm and using it for self-protection and carrying that firearm and doing all of the things to responsibly use that firearm is always going to benefit society. It's always going to deter crime. It's always going to make sure that society is safer. There's nothing wrong with taking responsibility for your life, for your family's life. And this is not a right-wing propaganda video. This is not a left-wing propaganda video. This is just talking about the statistics from multiple sources. Now, a lot of times when you're talking about people who are against guns, against the ownership of guns, against the carrying of firearms, you hear a lot of, I just don't feel safe. I don't feel comfortable. It scares me. They get kind of more emotionally connected or disconnected from the idea of having a firearm than they do the actual numbers. It's kind of like, yeah, the chances of this bungee cord breaking when I jump off this cliff is pretty slim, but I still don't like it, When we are talking about people with more emotional responses, and that's completely fine for you to have an emotional response. I'm not, I'm not picking on that. But in order to cater that emotional response, let me give you a couple things that you might find empathetic. Kind of some situations, and if you are trying to convince someone who is kind of in the boat of being against guns and more for gun control, maybe you could throw this at them and see what they say. For instance, you're at a restaurant with your friend or your family and you're sitting there, and all of a sudden you're just eating your meal, and then all of a sudden a guy comes in and shoots the cashier, and he has a rifle, for instance, or a handgun, it doesn't really matter. And he shoots the cashier, and maybe he shoots some other people. He shoots 2 or 3 people. He's making his way over to you at that lobby while you're eating. In that moment, at that second, would you rather have a handgun or a cell phone to call the police to get response there to save you from this madman? And in that moment, 100% you would want a firearm. That's inarguable. If you say that you would want a cell phone in that instance, you're just asking for death. Another thing, talking about mass shootings, we've heard numerous times of teachers blockading the doorway with their bodies and using their bodies as a sacrificial shield to prevent children in that room from being harmed by the shooter. In that instance, with that angel of a teacher using their body and sacrificing themselves and willing to sacrificing themselves and having the bravery to do something so stoic and so heroic, in that instance, would you rather them just remain unarmed and just use their body as a shield, or would you rather them have a firearm to return fire to that mass shooter? And again, just like the scenario that I painted before, if you were to say, oh, I just wish he didn't have a firearm, I think I'm against that, you're a monster. I mean, that's completely ridiculous to not want that person to have some kind of tool to be able to fight back. If they were brave enough to, sacrifice themselves, they're most certainly brave enough to shoot back. And, the last one you have to think, if you're sleeping at night and it's 2 in the morning and you hear a bump in the night and you hear someone breaking in and they start ransacking your house, and they start, you get into the closet and close you and your kids are hunkering down in the closet, and they're bust into the bedroom and they're trying to open up the closet, and you're trying to keep the door shut and all that kind of stuff. In that instance, would you rather have a firearm to have at the other end of that door to protect yourself and your family, or would you rather have a cell phone in your hand talking to dispatch with police 18 minutes away? These are inarguable. These are things to where, God forbid if you ever get into these situations, but this is why people carry. It's because of these kind of things. And I think it's because, gun ownership, you have to have, I feel more empathy than a non-gun owner, just because you have to really put yourself into a scenario that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And at the end of the day, responsible gun ownership always is a good thing. Carry a gun. Use this video to, show to your friends, show to people that might be a little bit questioning of it. I hope this helps. And that's all we got. For $1 single a month, you get a shot at winning a free custom holster to your liking for our April sweepstakes. And then every month after that, we give away more stuff, like apparel, like this hoodie, or these shirts, more holsters like these, and insane deals that you would be stupid not to take advantage of. In addition to that, you get an exclusive year-round discount code just for you, and completely unfiltered, uncensored content that can't be posted anywhere else. So for $1 measly a month, you can join our Patreon family and instantly claim all the benefits. If any of this interests you, you can either click the link in the description below, or you can visit us at AmericanConcealment.com to get started. We're American Concealment Solutions, and we safeguard the tools of liberty. I'll see you on Patreon.